Priscilla had always been a force to be reckoned with. Even at 55 years old, the vibrant widow carried herself with a youthful energy that both charmed and exasperated those around her. So when a fire ravaged her cozy bungalow, leaving her homeless, her daughter Karen knew there was only one place for her mother to go: their family home. "It'll just be for a little while, I promise," Karen assured her husband Robert as they prepared the guest room for Priscilla's arrival. Robert simply grunted in response, already dreading the disruption to their peaceful household. Sure enough, the moment Priscilla swept through the door, bags in hand, the entire dynamic shifted. She fussed over the decor, complained about the lumpy mattress, and made no effort to help with any chores. Robert clenched his jaw, biting back the sarcastic retorts that threatened to spill out. "Darling, you've done such a lovely job making me feel at home," Priscilla cooed, pinching Karen's cheek affectionately. Robert rolled his eyes behind her back. Over the next few weeks, the tension in the house became palpable. Priscilla seemed to go out of her way to antagonize Robert, making snide comments about his work and criticizing his every move. Karen, ever the peacekeeper, would gently remind them to play nice, but her pleas often fell on deaf ears. One evening, as Robert was clearing the dinner table, he noticed his favorite gold cufflinks were missing from the catch-all dish on the entryway table. Frowning, he retraced his steps, searching high and low, but the cufflinks were nowhere to be found. "Have you seen my cufflinks, dear?" he asked Karen, trying to keep the irritation out of his voice. Karen shook her head apologetically. "No, I haven't. Maybe they fell behind the table or something. I'm sure they'll turn up." But Robert wasn't convinced. As the days passed, other small valuables began disappearing. A vintage lighter, a set of pearl earrings, even a silver money clip that had been a gift from his late father. Each time, Robert would confront Karen, only to be met with a shrug and a reassurance that the items would reappear. "You know how absent-minded Mother can be," Karen would sigh, her brow creased with worry. "I'm sure she's just misplaced them somewhere." Robert knew better. He'd caught Priscilla eyeing his prized possessions more than once, a gleam of greed in her eyes. Silently, he began devising a plan to catch the thief in the act. One night, after Karen had gone to bed, Robert carefully arranged a trap. He placed a pair of antique cufflinks on the entryway table, then hid himself in the nearby closet, waiting with bated breath. It didn't take long before Priscilla emerged from her room, her slippered feet padding softly across the hardwood. Robert watched, his heart pounding as she paused in front of the table, her gaze zeroing in on the cufflinks. Glancing around furtively, she quickly scooped them up and started to retreat. "Going somewhere, Mother?" Robert said, stepping out of the closet and flicking on the light. Priscilla froze, the cufflinks clutched in her hand. Her eyes widened in alarm, then narrowed as she realized she'd been caught. "Robert, darling, I was just—" "Save it!" Robert snapped, cutting her off. "I know exactly what you were doing." Priscilla's shoulders slumped, and for a moment she looked every bit her age. But then a sly smile crept across her face. "Well, now that you've caught me, what are you going to do about it?" Priscilla purred, her eyes glinting with a predatory gleam. Robert's mouth felt dry as he tried to find the right words. I could tell Karen," he said, his voice wavering slightly. Priscilla let out a soft chuckle. "But you won't, will you, dear?" She took a step closer, her perfume enveloping him. "After all, that would only upset my poor, darling daughter. And we wouldn't want that, would we?" Robert swallowed hard, his gaze flickering between Priscilla's face and the cufflinks in her hand. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Priscilla's lips curled into a sly smile. "Why, I think you know exactly what I want, Robert." She reached out and trailed a finger down his arm, sending a shiver down his spine. The realization of what she was suggesting hit him like a ton of bricks. Robert felt bile rise in his throat as he understood the implication behind her words. "You can't be serious," he choked out. "Oh, but I am," Priscilla purred, her hand now resting on his chest. "I think this could be the start of a very mutually beneficial arrangement." Robert's mind raced, his heart pounding. He knew he should refuse, that he should march straight to Karen and tell her everything. But the thought of upsetting his wife, of destroying the fragile peace in their home, was too much to bear. Sensing his hesitation, Priscilla pressed on. "Think about it, Robert. A little discreet intimacy between us, and I'll make sure your precious possessions stay right where they belong. She leaned in, her lips nearly brushing his ear. "And who knows, maybe I'll even have a few other rewards for you." The way she emphasized the word rewards sent a shiver of both revulsion and intrigue through Robert. He knew he was being manipulated, that Priscilla was playing on his weaknesses, but the temptation was too strong to ignore. Robert faltered, his resolve crumbling. I don't know." Priscilla pulled back, a triumphant smile spreading across her face. "Well, you know where to find me, darling," she purred, slipping the cufflinks into the pocket of her robe. With a wink, she turned and sauntered back to her room, leaving Robert alone in the dimly lit hallway, his mind reeling. As the sound of Priscilla's footsteps faded, Robert sank into a nearby chair, his head in his hands. What had he just agreed to? How could he even consider betraying Karen, the woman he loved more than anything? But the thought of losing his precious possessions, of having to confess to his wife, was too much to bear. And Priscilla had dangled the promise of rewards in front of him, awakening a dark curiosity within him. Groaning, Robert ran his hands through his hair. He knew he was walking a dangerous path, one that could shatter his marriage and destroy everything he held dear. But the temptation was just too strong to resist. With a heavy heart, Robert made his way back to the bedroom he shared with Karen, his mind already racing with the implications of the arrangement he had unwittingly agreed to. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of stolen glances, secret meetings, and hushed whispers. Whenever Priscilla would catch Robert's eye, a silent understanding would pass between them, a silent agreement to keep their newfound intimacy hidden from prying eyes. Robert found himself torn, his guilt and desire warring within him. On one hand, he was disgusted with himself for betraying Karen, the woman he had vowed to love and cherish until the end of his days. But on the other, the thrill of their forbidden encounters, the way Priscilla's touch ignited a fire within him, was impossible to ignore. The guilt weighed heavily on him, especially when he looked at Karen's trusting face. He would lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering how he could ever confess his sins to her. The thought of shattering her heart, of destroying the life they had built together, was too much to bear. And so, Robert found himself falling deeper and deeper into Priscilla's web, his resolve crumbling with each stolen moment, each whispered promise of rewards to come. He knew he was playing a dangerous game, but the temptation was too strong to resist. As the days turned into weeks, the tension in the household grew palpable. Priscilla would often shoot Robert knowing glances, her eyes sparkling with mischief, while Karen remained blissfully unaware of the betrayal unfolding beneath her nose. Robert found himself constantly on edge, jumping at every sound, terrified that his wife would somehow discover the truth. The weight of his guilt was crushing, and he knew that he couldn't keep up the charade forever. But still, he found himself drawn to Priscilla, like a moth to a flame. The forbidden nature of their affair only seemed to heighten the thrill, and Robert found himself craving her touch, her whispered words of seduction. It was a vicious cycle, one that Robert knew he needed to break. But every time he tried to pull away, Priscilla would dangle the threat of exposing their secret, or promise him something even more tantalizing, and his resolve would crumble. As the days turned into weeks, Robert found himself sinking deeper and deeper into the dark, twisting web of deceit and desire that Priscilla had spun around him. And with each passing day, the thought of finally breaking free seemed more and more impossible. The weeks turned into months as Priscilla's house was slowly rebuilt, but her absence from Karen and Robert's home did little to ease the guilt that had settled over Robert like a suffocating fog. With each passing day, the weight of his betrayal grew heavier, threatening to crush him. Yet, try as he might, Robert found himself unable to break free from Priscilla's hold. The thrill of their forbidden encounters, the way her touch ignited a fire within him, had become an addiction he couldn't shake. And Priscilla, ever the cunning manipulator, continued to tighten the noose around his neck, dangling the threat of exposure over him like the sword of Damocles. As Priscilla moved back into her newly renovated bungalow, Robert thought that perhaps, just perhaps, he could sever the twisted ties that bound them. But Priscilla had other plans. She began making constant demands, insisting that Robert visit her under the guise of checking in on his mother-in-law, or else face the consequences of her revealing their sordid secret. Robert's heart would race with panic every time his phone buzzed, terrified that it might be Priscilla summoning him once more. He knew he should put a stop to it, to confess everything to Karen and face the consequences of his actions. But the thought of losing his wife, of shattering the life they had built together, was too much for him to bear. So, like a trapped animal, Robert continued to dance to Priscilla's tune, his guilt and self-loathing growing with each passing day. He would return home from his visits with Priscilla, his mind clouded with shame and his body aching from their heated encounters. And every time he looked into Karen's trusting eyes, he felt like the lowest of the low. The tension in the household was palpable, with Karen occasionally voicing her concerns about her mother's continued demands on her husband's time. Robert would brush it off, offering vague excuses and half-truths, hating himself for the deception that was slowly consuming him. One night, as Robert lay awake staring at the ceiling, the weight of his guilt became too much to bear. He tossed and turned, his mind racing with the what-ifs and the consequences of his actions. What if Karen found out? What if Priscilla decided to reveal their secret out of spite? The very thought of it made his stomach churn. Quietly, Robert slipped out of bed, careful not to disturb Karen's peaceful slumber. He needed to clear his head, to find a way to break free from this tangled web of deceit. Pulling on a jacket, he stepped out into the cool night air, his footsteps echoing in the silence. As he walked, Robert's mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Part of him yearned to confess everything to Karen, to beg for her forgiveness and start anew. But the fear of losing her, of shattering the life they had built together, was paralyzing. And the thought of Priscilla's wrath, of the consequences she might unleash, filled him with a sense of dread. Unbeknownst to Robert, Priscilla had been watching his restless movements from her bedroom window in the neighboring house. A sly smile crept across her face as she realized that her hold on him was tightening. With a few taps on her phone, she summoned him, knowing full well that he would come running, like a dog on a leash. The buzzing of his phone startled Robert, and his heart sank as he read Priscilla's message. He knew he should ignore it, to finally put an end to this twisted game. But the fear of what she might do if he defied her was too strong. Cursing under his breath, he changed direction, heading towards Priscilla's bungalow, his shoulders slumped in resignation. As he approached the door, Priscilla greeted him with a coy smile, her eyes glinting with a predatory gleam. "I was beginning to worry you wouldn't come, darling," she purred, beckoning him inside. Robert swallowed hard, his mouth dry. "Priscilla, I can't keep doing this. It's tearing me apart." His voice trembled with a mixture of desperation and resolve. Priscilla's expression hardened, and she stepped closer, her fingers tracing the lapel of his jacket. "Oh, but you can, Robert. And you will." Her voice was low and menacing. "You know what's at stake if you refuse." Robert felt his heart pounding in his chest, the familiar panic rising within him. He knew he had to find a way to break free, to end this torment once and for all. But the thought of losing everything, his wife, his home, his reputation, was too much to bear. Sensing his hesitation, Priscilla leaned in, her breath tickling his ear. "Remember, darling, our little secret is safe with me. As long as you keep doing exactly as I say." Robert squeezed his eyes shut, his fists clenching at his sides. He was trapped, a prisoner in Priscilla's twisted game, with no clear path to freedom. The guilt, the shame, the constant fear, it was all consuming, slowly eroding his very soul. With a resigned sigh, Robert stepped over the threshold, allowing Priscilla to pull him deeper into the web of deceit. As the door closed behind him, he felt a piece of himself die, the weight of his betrayal growing heavier with each passing moment despite the pleasure. The night dragged on, and Robert found himself trapped in Priscilla's clutches once more, his body betraying him even as his mind screamed for release. He hated himself, hated the woman who held him in her thrall, hated the circumstances that had led him down this dark path. As the first rays of dawn began to peek over the horizon, Robert finally emerged from Priscilla's bungalow, his clothes disheveled and his heart heavy. He knew he couldn't keep up this charade much longer, that the guilt and the fear would eventually consume him. But the thought of losing everything, his wife, his home, his very sense of self, was too much to bear. And so, like a man walking to the gallows, Robert trudged back home, his mind already racing with the next steps in Priscilla's twisted game.